The sun barely touched the horizon when Sergeant Major Robert "Tank" Morrison stepped onto the training grounds of Fort Bradley. His boots made sharp sounds against the concrete as he walked toward the assembly area. At 42 years old, Tank had served in the military for over 20 years. His chest was covered with ribbons and medals that told stories of battles fought and won. His reputation as a tough drill instructor was known throughout the base. Tank believed that soldiers were made through discipline and fear. He had trained hundreds of recruits over the years, and his methods were harsh but effective. Most of his former students went on to become excellent soldiers. However, Tank's approach to training often crossed the line between tough instruction and abuse. On this particular Tuesday morning, Tank was assigned to train a group of new recruits who had arrived at the base just 2 weeks earlier. Among them was Private Sarah Mitchell, a 20-year-old woman from a small town in Ohio. Sarah had joined the military to serve her country and to escape the poverty that had defined her childhood. She was determined to prove herself worthy of wearing the uniform. Sarah had always been smaller than her peers, but what she lacked in physical size, she made up for in determination and intelligence. During her first week of training, she had impressed her instructors with her ability to learn quickly and her willingness to help other recruits who were struggling. However, Tank saw her differently. To him, Sarah represented everything he thought was wrong with the modern military. The training session began at 0600 hours sharp. Tank gathered the recruits in formation and began his usual morning speech about discipline, honor, and the importance of following orders without question. His voice echoed across the training ground as he paced back and forth in front of the nervous young soldiers. "Listen up, maggots!" Tank shouted, his voice carrying across the field. "Today we're going to separate the soldiers from the pretenders. Some of you think you can coast through this training because you scored well on some tests. Let me tell you something. Real combat doesn't care about your test scores." The recruits stood at attention, their eyes fixed straight ahead as Tank continued his intimidating speech. Sarah felt her heart racing, but she kept her composure. She had heard stories about Tank's training methods from other recruits, and she was determined not to let him break her spirit. The morning training consisted of various combat drills designed to test the recruits' physical and mental toughness. They crawled through mud under barbed wire, climbed rope walls, and practiced hand-to-hand combat techniques. Tank moved among the recruits like a predator, looking for any sign of weakness or failure. During the rope climbing exercise, Sarah struggled more than usual. She had twisted her ankle during the previous day's training, but she hadn't reported it because she didn't want to be seen as weak. As she reached for the next rope hold, her injured ankle gave way slightly, causing her to slip down a few feet. Tank noticed immediately. He stormed over to the rope where Sarah was hanging, his face red with anger. "What's wrong with you, Mitchell? Are you too weak to climb a simple rope? Maybe you should have stayed home and played with dolls instead of trying to be a soldier." Sarah gritted her teeth and continued climbing, ignoring the pain in her ankle and the humiliation of Tank's words. She knew that responding would only make things worse. Other recruits watched nervously as Tank continued to berate her. "I asked you a question, soldier!" Tank screamed from below. "Are you deaf as well as weak?" Sarah reached the top of the rope and began her descent. When she reached the ground, Tank was waiting for her. His face was inches from hers as he continued his verbal assault. "In my 20 years of training soldiers, I've never seen such a pathetic display. You're going to get your fellow soldiers killed if you can't handle basic training." The other recruits shifted uncomfortably as they watched the confrontation. They had all experienced Tank's verbal abuse, but this seemed more intense than usual. Sarah stood at attention, her jaw clenched as she endured the humiliation. After the rope climbing exercise, the group moved on to hand-to-hand combat training. This was Tank's favorite part of the day because it allowed him to demonstrate his physical superiority over the recruits. He often used these sessions to single out individuals who had annoyed him and give them a lesson they wouldn't forget. Tank called Sarah to the center of the training mat. "Mitchell, since you seem to think you can handle military training despite your obvious limitations, let's see how you do in combat. Maybe a little reality check will help you understand where you belong." Sarah stepped onto the mat, knowing that this was not going to be a fair fight. Tank outweighed her by more than 80 pounds and had decades of combat experience. However, she also knew that refusing would be seen as insubordination and could result in her being dismissed from the military. "The exercise is simple," Tank explained to the watching recruits. Private Mitchell is going to try to take me down using the techniques we've been practicing. If she succeeds, everyone gets an hour off for lunch. If she fails, he paused for dramatic effect. Well, let's just say the rest of your day won't be very pleasant. Sarah took her fighting stance, remembering the techniques she had learned in her previous training sessions. She knew she couldn't match Tank's strength, but she hoped her speed and agility might give her an advantage. The other recruits formed a circle around the mat, some hoping Sarah would succeed, others afraid of what would happen if she failed. Tank circled Sarah like a lion stalking its prey. His experience in combat was evident in every movement. He was testing her, looking for openings, trying to intimidate her with his presence. Sarah kept her guard up and tried to stay light on her feet, despite the pain in her ankle. Without warning, Tank lunged forward with a takedown attempt. Sarah managed to sidestep and counter with a technique she had learned, but Tank's experience allowed him to easily defend against her attack. He grabbed her arm and used her momentum to throw her to the mat with more force than necessary for a training exercise. Sarah hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She rolled away quickly and got back to her feet, but Tank was already moving toward her again. This time, his attack was more aggressive, and Sarah found herself on the defensive, trying to avoid his powerful strikes. The training exercise continued for several more minutes, with Tank becoming increasingly aggressive. It was clear to everyone watching that this had moved beyond training and had become something much more sinister. Tank was using his position of authority to physically dominate Sarah in front of her peers. Finally, Tank managed to grab Sarah in a hold that she couldn't escape. Instead of calling the exercise complete, he tightened his grip and lifted her off the ground. "This is what happens when you're not strong enough," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "In real combat, the enemy won't go easy on you because you're small." Sarah struggled to break free, but Tank's grip was too strong. She could feel her air supply being cut off, and panic began to set in. The other recruits watched in horror, unsure whether they should intervene or if this was part of the training. Just as Sarah felt herself beginning to lose consciousness, Tank released his hold and let her drop to the mat. She gasped for air as she hit the ground, her vision blurry and her body shaking from the experience. Tank stood over her with a satisfied smirk on his face. "Get up, Mitchell," Tank commanded. "We're not done yet." Sarah struggled to her feet, her legs unsteady and her breathing still labored. She could see the concerned faces of her fellow recruits, but she also knew that they were powerless to help her. Tank was in complete control of the situation. "Now," Tank continued, "let's try this again. And this time, maybe you'll put up a better fight." Sarah raised her hands again, knowing that she had no choice but to continue. Her ankle was throbbing, her ribs ached from hitting the mat, and she was still dizzy from being choked. But she also knew that giving up would mean the end of her military career. Tank's second attack was even more vicious than the first. He seemed to be taking pleasure in demonstrating his dominance over Sarah. His techniques went far beyond what was necessary for training, and several times he used his size advantage to inflict unnecessary pain. During one exchange, Tank grabbed Sarah's arm and twisted it behind her back in a submission hold. Instead of stopping when she tapped out to signal submission, he continued to apply pressure until Sarah cried out in pain. The sound echoed across the training ground, causing several nearby instructors to look in their direction. "What's wrong, Mitchell?" Tank taunted as he maintained the painful hold. "Can't handle a little pressure? Maybe you should consider a different career path." Sarah's arm felt like it was about to break, but she refused to beg for mercy. She knew that Tank was trying to break her spirit as much as her body. Through the pain, she managed to speak in a steady voice. "I won't quit, Sergeant Major." Tank's eyes flashed with anger at Sarah's defiance. In his mind, she should have been begging for mercy by now. Her refusal to submit to his intimidation tactics infuriated him. He released the arm hold but immediately transitioned to another aggressive attack. As the exercise continued, Tank's actions became increasingly reckless. He was no longer trying to teach Sarah anything about combat. He was simply using his authority to abuse her. The other recruits watched in growing alarm as their instructor crossed line after line of appropriate conduct. Finally, Tank managed to put Sarah in another submission hold, this time a chokehold that cut off both her air and blood supply. Sarah's vision began to fade as Tank applied pressure to the arteries in her neck. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears as consciousness began to slip away. Just as she was about to pass out completely, Sarah heard Tank's voice close to her ear. "Are you ready to quit now, soldier? Are you ready to admit that you don't belong here?" Through the haze of oxygen deprivation, Sarah managed to shake her head slightly. Even in her compromised state, she refused to give Tank the satisfaction of her surrender. This act of defiance would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. Tank's face twisted with rage at Sarah's continued resistance. In that moment, he lost the last vestiges of his professional control. What happened next would end his career and change the lives of everyone present on the training ground that morning. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting longer shadows across the training area. Other training groups could be heard in the distance, going through their own exercises under the supervision of their instructors. None of them were aware of the dangerous situation that was developing on Tank's training ground. As Sarah hung in Tank's chokehold, barely conscious, time seemed to slow down for everyone watching. The other recruits stood frozen, unsure whether they should intervene and risk their own careers or continue to watch their fellow soldier being abused by their instructor. What none of them knew was that their ordeal was about to take a dramatic turn that would expose Tank's abusive methods and bring justice to Fort Bradley. Tank's grip around Sarah's neck tightened as his anger reached a boiling point. 20 years of unchecked authority had created a monster who believed he was untouchable. The young woman in his arms represented everything he despised about the changing military: diversity, inclusion, and what he saw as weakness being celebrated instead of eliminated. Sarah's feet barely touched the ground as Tank held her in the brutal chokehold. Her vision was becoming darker, and she could feel her strength leaving her body. The other recruits watched in growing horror as their instructor crossed every line of professional conduct. Some of them wanted to intervene, but they knew that challenging a sergeant major could end their military careers before they had even begun. Private James Rodriguez, a 19-year-old from Texas who had become friends with Sarah during their training, took a small step forward. His hands were clenched into fists, and his face showed the internal struggle he was experiencing. He had been raised to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, but he also understood the rigid hierarchy of military life. "Sergeant Major," Rodriguez said quietly, his voice barely audible over Tank's heavy breathing. "Sir, I think she's had enough." Tank's head snapped toward Rodriguez, his eyes blazing with fury. "Did I ask for your opinion, maggot? Get back in line before I decide you need the same lesson." Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, looking at Sarah's pale face and closed eyes. Against every instinct for self-preservation, he took another step forward. "Sir, with respect, she's unconscious. The exercise should be over." Tank released Sarah so suddenly that she collapsed to the mat like a broken doll. Her body hit the ground with a sickening thud, and she lay motionless except for the slight rise and fall of her chest. Tank's attention was now completely focused on Rodriguez, who had dared to question his authority. "You want to be a hero, Rodriguez?" Tank snarled as he stalked toward the young man. "Let's see how heroic you feel when you're on the ground next to your girlfriend." The other recruits shifted nervously as Tank approached Rodriguez. They could see that their instructor had completely lost control, but they were too terrified to act. The military had drilled into them the absolute importance of following orders and respecting the chain of command. Challenging a superior officer was one of the most serious offenses a soldier could commit. Rodriguez stood his ground as Tank approached, even though every fiber of his being screamed at him to run. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood where backing down from a fight meant becoming a permanent victim. That same courage that had helped him survive the streets was now compelling him to stand up for Sarah. "I'm not looking for a fight, Sergeant Major," Rodriguez said, his voice steady despite his fear. "I just think that Private Mitchell needs medical attention." Tank stopped directly in front of Rodriguez, so close that the young man could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "You think? You think?" Tank's voice rose to a shout. "Nobody asked you to think, soldier. Your job is to follow orders and keep your mouth shut." Behind Tank, Sarah began to stir. She was regaining consciousness slowly, her body instinctively trying to protect itself as she curled into a defensive position. Her throat felt like it was on fire, and every breath was painful. Through blurred vision, she could see Tank confronting Rodriguez and realized that her fellow recruit was putting himself at risk to help her. Tank raised his hand as if he was about to strike Rodriguez, but the young man didn't flinch. This only made Tank angrier. In his twisted mind, Rodriguez's courage was another sign of disrespect that needed to be crushed. He had built his reputation on breaking the spirits of young soldiers, and he wasn't about to let one recruit's defiance undermine his authority. "You want to protect your little girlfriend?" Tank sneered. "Then you can take her place. Everyone in this unit is going to learn what happens when you don't show proper respect to your superiors." Sarah managed to push herself up on her elbows, still dizzy and struggling to breathe normally. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the choking. "Leave him alone. This is between you and me." Tank spun around to face Sarah, surprised that she was conscious and even more surprised that she was still defying him. In his experience, most recruits would be begging for mercy by this point. Sarah's continued resistance was like gasoline on the fire of his rage. "Oh, you're awake," Tank said with mock surprise. "Good. I was worried you might miss the rest of your lesson." Sarah struggled to her feet, using the wall of a nearby building for support. Her legs were unsteady, and she had to fight waves of dizziness. But she was determined not to show any more weakness. She could taste blood in her mouth, and she suspected that Tank had cracked one of her ribs during their training session. "I said leave him alone," Sarah repeated, her voice stronger now despite the pain in her throat. "He was just trying to help. Your problem is with me." Tank laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was the laugh of a predator who had cornered his prey. "My problem is with this entire generation of weak, entitled soldiers who think they can question authority. But you're right about one thing, Mitchell. You are my main problem." The standoff continued for several tense moments. Sarah and Rodriguez stood together facing Tank, while the other recruits formed a loose circle around them. The training ground had become completely quiet, except for the sound of their breathing and the distant noise of other military exercises. What none of them noticed was that their confrontation had attracted the attention of someone who had been observing from a distance. Master Sergeant Lisa Chen had been conducting her own training session with a different group of recruits when she heard Tank shouting. She had paused her own exercises to investigate the disturbance. Chen was a respected instructor with 15 years of military experience. She had heard rumors about Tank's methods, but she had never witnessed them firsthand. As she watched the scene unfold, she realized that she was seeing something far more serious than tough training. This was abuse, and it was her responsibility to intervene. However, Chen also understood the delicate politics of military hierarchy. Tank outranked her, and directly challenging him could have serious consequences for her own career. She needed to find a way to stop what was happening without creating a larger conflict that could harm everyone involved. While Chen debated her options, Tank was escalating the situation even further. He grabbed Sarah by the front of her uniform and pulled her close to his face. "You think you're tough, don't you, Mitchell? You think you can handle anything the military can throw at you?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I know I can, Sergeant Major." Tank's grip tightened on her uniform, and Sarah could see the veins bulging in his neck as his anger reached new heights. "We'll see about that," he growled. "When I'm done with you, you'll be begging to go home to Mommy and Daddy." What happened next would be burned into the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. Tank drew back his right hand and struck Sarah across the face with a vicious backhand slap. The sound of the impact echoed across the training ground like a gunshot. Sarah's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, and she staggered backward. Blood began to flow from her nose, and a red handprint appeared on her cheek. For a moment, everyone stood frozen in shock. Even Tank seemed surprised by his own actions, as if he couldn't believe he had actually struck a recruit. The silence that followed was deafening. Rodriguez started to move toward Tank, his fists clenched, but Sarah grabbed his arm to stop him. She knew that any retaliation would only make things worse for all of them. Despite the pain and humiliation, she forced herself to remain standing and maintain eye contact with Tank. "Is that supposed to break me?" Sarah asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the blood running down her face. "Because it's going to take a lot more than that." Tank's face turned an even deeper shade of red. In his 20-year career, no recruit had ever shown such defiance after being struck. Sarah's courage was undermining everything he believed about fear and intimidation as training tools. He raised his hand again, preparing to deliver an even more brutal blow. Master Sergeant Chen had seen enough. Military protocol demanded that she go through proper channels to report Tank's behavior, but she couldn't stand by and watch him continue to assault a recruit. She stepped out from her observation point and called out across the training ground, "Sergeant Major Morrison!" Chen's voice cut through the air with the authority of someone who had commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. "What's the status of your training exercise?" Tank froze with his hand still raised, suddenly aware that his actions had been witnessed by another instructor. He slowly lowered his arm and turned to face Chen, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way to explain what she had just seen. "Master Sergeant Chen," Tank replied, forcing his voice to sound casual. "Just conducting some advanced combat training. These recruits need to understand what real fighting feels like." Chen approached the group, her experienced eyes taking in every detail of the scene. She could see the blood on Sarah's face, the fear in the other recruits' eyes, and the barely controlled rage in Tank's posture. This was clearly not a normal training exercise. "I see," Chen said calmly. "And does advanced combat training typically involve striking recruits who aren't wearing protective gear?" Tank's jaw tightened as he realized that Chen wasn't going to be easily fooled by his explanation. "Sometimes extreme measures are necessary to prepare soldiers for the realities of combat, Master Sergeant. These recruits need to understand that the enemy won't pull their punches." Chen nodded slowly, but her expression remained skeptical. "Perhaps you could demonstrate these advanced techniques on someone with similar training and experience? I'd be happy to volunteer as your training partner." The challenge in Chen's voice was unmistakable. She was offering Tank the opportunity to try his advanced techniques on someone who could fight back, rather than abusing recruits who were powerless to defend themselves. Tank's face paled slightly, as he realized that his actions had serious consequences. "That won't be necessary," Tank said quickly. "I think these recruits have learned enough for today." But the damage had already been done. Chen had witnessed Tank striking Sarah, and there was no way to undo that fact. The other recruits had also seen their instructor lose control and assault a fellow soldier. Word of the incident would spread throughout the base, and Tank's career was about to face its most serious challenge. As if summoned by some invisible signal, other figures began to appear around the training ground. A military police officer, who had been conducting routine patrols, noticed the gathering and decided to investigate. A base chaplain who had been visiting different training areas stopped to observe what was happening. And most importantly, a base commander's vehicle could be seen in the distance, heading in their direction. Tank looked around at the growing number of witnesses and realized that his 20-year career might be coming to an end. The absolute power he had wielded over recruits was evaporating before his eyes, replaced by the cold reality of military justice and accountability. Sarah wiped the blood from her nose with the back of her hand and straightened her shoulders. Despite everything Tank had put her through, she remained standing. Her courage had not only saved her own dignity, but had also exposed the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight at Fort Bradley. The young woman from Ohio who had joined the military to escape poverty and serve her country had unknowingly sparked a chain of events that would reshape the entire training program at the base. Her refusal to submit to Tank's intimidation had revealed the difference between legitimate military training and abuse of power. As more officials arrived on the scene, Tank Morrison realized that his reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The recruits he had bullied for so many years were about to see justice served, and the military would be forced to confront the toxic culture that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked for so long. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky, but for everyone present on the training ground, the day had already become one they would never forget. The events that were about to unfold would prove that even in the rigid hierarchy of military life, there were still people willing to stand up for what was right. The black staff car moved across the base with purpose, its occupants unaware of the drama unfolding on the training ground. Inside the vehicle, 4 of the most senior officers at Fort Bradley were returning from a meeting at the Pentagon. They had spent the morning discussing new policies for recruit training and the importance of maintaining professional standards throughout the military. Colonel Patricia Williams sat in the front passenger seat, reviewing notes from their meeting. As the base's Inspector General, she was responsible for investigating complaints and ensuring that all military personnel followed proper procedures. At 55 years old, Williams had broken numerous barriers during her 30-year career and had zero tolerance for abuse of authority. Behind her sat Colonel Marcus Thompson, the base's training commander. Thompson was directly responsible for overseeing all recruit training programs and ensuring that instructors maintained the highest standards of professionalism. His reputation for fairness and integrity had earned him respect throughout the military hierarchy. Next to Thompson was Colonel David Park, the base's staff judge advocate. As the senior legal officer, Park was responsible for ensuring that military law was properly enforced and that justice was served when violations occurred. His presence in the car would prove to be particularly significant given what they were about to witness. The driver was Colonel James Sullivan, the base's deputy commander. Sullivan was second in command of the entire installation and had the authority to make immediate decisions when situations required swift action. His 28 years of military experience had taught him to recognize problems quickly and address them decisively. As their car approached the training area, Colonel Sullivan noticed an unusual gathering of people around one of the exercise grounds. Military police were present, along with several instructors and what appeared to be a group of recruits in formation. The scene looked tense, and Sullivan's instincts told him that something serious was happening. "Marcus," Sullivan said to Colonel Thompson, "isn't that your training area over there? What's all the commotion about?" Thompson looked in the direction Sullivan was pointing and frowned. He could see Master Sergeant Chen talking to someone in uniform, surrounded by a group of recruits who looked distressed. Military police presence at a training exercise was never a good sign. "I'm not sure," Thompson replied, "but we should probably check it out. Chen is one of my best instructors, and she wouldn't call for MP support unless something serious had happened." Sullivan changed course and drove toward the training ground. As they got closer, the colonels could see more details of what was taking place. A female recruit had blood on her face, several recruits looked visibly shaken, and Sergeant Major Morrison appeared to be in some kind of confrontation with Master Sergeant Chen. Colonel Williams immediately recognized the signs of a serious incident. Her experience as Inspector General had taught her to read body language and situational dynamics quickly. "Jim," she said to Sullivan, "we need to stop here immediately. This looks like something that requires command attention." The staff car came to a halt at the edge of the training area, and all four colonels stepped out simultaneously. Their arrival had an immediate impact on everyone present. Conversation stopped, and people instinctively moved to attention positions. The presence of four full colonels at a routine training exercise was unprecedented. Tank Morrison felt his heart sink as he recognized the occupants of the staff car. These were some of the most senior officers on the base, people who had the authority to end his career with a single decision. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way to explain what they were about to discover. Master Sergeant Chen approached the colonels and rendered a crisp salute. "Good morning, colonels. I'm afraid we have a situation here that requires command attention." Colonel Thompson returned the salute and stepped forward. "What's the nature of the situation, Master Sergeant?" Chen chose her words carefully, knowing that her report would have serious consequences for everyone involved. "Sir, I witnessed Sergeant Major Morrison strike Private Mitchell during what was supposed to be a training exercise. The recruit is injured and may require medical attention." The four colonels exchanged glances, their expressions growing more serious. Colonel Park immediately began taking mental notes for what he knew would become a formal investigation. Colonel Williams moved toward Sarah to assess her condition, while Colonel Sullivan's attention focused on Tank Morrison. "Sergeant Major Morrison," Sullivan said in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority, "please explain what happened here." Tank struggled to maintain his composure as he faced the four senior officers. 20 years of military service had taught him the importance of chain of command, but now that same hierarchy was working against him. He knew that lying to colonels would only make his situation worse, but telling the truth would essentially end his career. "Sir," Tank began, his voice noticeably less confident than usual, "I was conducting advanced combat training with these recruits. Private Mitchell was having difficulty with the exercises, and I was attempting to demonstrate the realities of combat situations." Colonel Williams had reached Sarah and was examining the injuries to her face. The handprint on her cheek was clearly visible, and blood was still trickling from her nose. Her training as Inspector General had shown her countless cases of abuse, and she recognized the signs immediately. "Private Mitchell," Williams said gently, "I'm Colonel Williams, the base Inspector General. Can you tell me what happened here?" Sarah looked at the colonel, then glanced at Tank Morrison. She knew that her next words would change everything. not just for herself, but for everyone involved. The young woman from Ohio had joined the military to serve her country with honor, and now she was being asked to decide whether to expose the corruption she had witnessed. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her injuries, "Sergeant Major Morrison was conducting training, but it became something more than that. He struck me when I refused to quit." Colonel Thompson moved closer to hear Sarah's account. "Refused to quit what, Private?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that there was no turning back now. "The sergeant major was using training as an excuse to hurt me, sir. When I wouldn't give up or admit that I was too weak to be a soldier, he hit me." The silence that followed Sarah's words was profound. Tank Morrison realized that his career was effectively over. The other recruits stood motionless, watching their abusive instructor face the consequences of his actions for the first time in his career. Colonel Park stepped forward, his legal training kicking in as he began to gather facts for what would undoubtedly become a formal investigation and possible court-martial. "Sergeant Major Morrison, is Private Mitchell's account accurate?" Tank's face flushed red as he struggled with his response. Admitting guilt would end his career immediately, but lying to 4 colonels would result in additional charges that could lead to imprisonment. His 20 years of bullying recruits had finally caught up with him. "Sir, the situation was complicated," Tank said weakly. "Private Mitchell was being insubordinate, and I felt that stronger measures were necessary to maintain discipline." Colonel Sullivan's expression darkened. "Stronger measures? Are you telling me that you believe striking a recruit is an appropriate response to insubordination?" Before Tank could answer, Private Rodriguez stepped forward. The young man from Texas had found his courage, and the presence of 4 colonels gave him the protection he needed to speak the truth. "Sir," Rodriguez said, addressing Colonel Sullivan, "Sergeant Major Morrison choked Private Mitchell unconscious during the training exercise. When she woke up and still refused to quit, he hit her. I tried to intervene, but he threatened to do the same to me." The revelation that Tank had choked a recruit unconscious sent shockwaves through the group of senior officers. This wasn't just inappropriate training. This was criminal assault. Colonel Park immediately began planning the legal proceedings that would follow. Colonel Williams completed her examination of Sarah's injuries and turned to face Tank Morrison. Her voice was ice-cold as she spoke. "Sergeant Major, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. You will report to the base commander's office within the hour for formal proceedings." Tank's legs felt weak as the reality of his situation hit him. Everything he had worked for during his 20-year career was gone in an instant. The power he had wielded over recruits, the fear he had inspired, the respect he thought he had earned, it was all crumbling around him. Colonel Thompson addressed the group of recruits who had witnessed the abuse. "I want all of you to know that what happened here today is absolutely unacceptable and does not represent the values of our military. You will all be interviewed individually as part of the investigation, and I want you to tell the complete truth about what you witnessed." The recruits nodded, still processing the rapid turn of events. Many of them had suffered under Tank's abusive training methods, but they had never imagined that justice would come so swiftly and decisively. Seeing their tormentor being held accountable gave them hope that the military truly was committed to protecting its people. Colonel Park began the formal process by reading Tank his rights under military law. "Sergeant Major Morrison, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to legal representation. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court-martial proceeding." As the legal proceedings began, Master Sergeant Chen approached Sarah to check on her condition. "How are you feeling, Private? Do you need medical attention?" Sarah nodded, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the extent of her injuries. "Yes, ma'am. My throat is very sore, and I think something might be wrong with my ribs." Colonel Williams immediately called for medical personnel to respond to the training area. Within minutes, paramedics arrived and began treating Sarah's injuries. The sight of a recruit receiving medical treatment for injuries inflicted by an instructor sent a clear message to everyone present about the seriousness of the situation. As Sarah was being treated, other recruits began to come forward with their own stories of abuse at Tank's hands. Private Johnson told Colonel Thompson about being forced to do push-ups until he vomited. Private Garcia described being verbally abused and humiliated in front of his peers. One by one, a pattern of systematic abuse emerged that went far beyond tough training. Tank Morrison stood isolated as his world collapsed around him. The recruits he had terrorized were finding their voices. The instructors he had intimidated were speaking out, and the senior officers were taking swift action to ensure justice was served. His reign of terror at Fort Bradley was finally coming to an end. Colonel Sullivan used his radio to contact the base commander and inform him of the situation. "Sir, we have a serious incident involving Sergeant Major Morrison and recruit abuse. We need to initiate immediate administrative and legal proceedings." The response from the base commander was swift and decisive. Tank Morrison would be confined to quarters pending a full investigation. His access to recruits would be terminated immediately, and he would face both administrative punishment and criminal charges under military law. As the gravity of the situation became clear, Tank made one final attempt to salvage his career. "Colonels, I've served this country faithfully for 20 years. I've trained hundreds of soldiers who went on to serve with distinction. Surely my record of service should count for something?" Colonel Williams turned to face Tank, her expression showing no sympathy for his plea. "Your record of service is exactly why this situation is so serious, Sergeant Major. You were entrusted with the responsibility of training the next generation of soldiers, and you betrayed that trust. Your actions don't just harm individual recruits. They undermine the entire military justice system." Colonel Park added, "Furthermore, your rank and experience make your crimes more serious, not less. You knew better, and you chose to abuse your authority anyway. That will be reflected in the charges you face." Tank realized that his appeals were falling on deaf ears. The very hierarchy that had protected him for so long was now working against him. The colonels who outranked him were ensuring that military justice was served, regardless of his past service record. As military police arrived to escort Tank from the training area, he looked back at the recruits he had abused for so many weeks. Some of them watched him with satisfaction, finally seeing their tormentor face consequences for his actions. Others looked away, perhaps feeling a mixture of relief and sadness that their ordeal was finally over. Private Sarah Mitchell stood with the paramedics, receiving treatment for her injuries while watching her abuser being led away. The young woman who had refused to quit despite being choked unconscious and struck in the face had achieved something remarkable. Her courage had not only saved herself, but had exposed a system of abuse that had operated in the shadows for far too long. The 4 colonels remained on the training ground to ensure that proper procedures were followed and that all witnesses were properly interviewed. Their unexpected arrival had prevented further abuse and ensured that justice was served swiftly. The morning that had started as routine training had become a turning point for recruit training at Fort Bradley. As Tank Morrison was driven away in the back of a military police vehicle, he knew that his life as he had known it was over. The man who had built his identity around intimidating and controlling others was about to learn what it felt like to be powerless in the face of a system designed to ensure justice and accountability. The base commander's office at Fort Bradley had never seen such intense activity. Within 2 hours of the incident on the training ground, Colonel Richard Hayes had assembled a crisis response team that included military investigators, legal officers, medical personnel, and communication specialists. The assault of Private Mitchell by Sergeant Major Morrison had triggered a chain reaction that would reshape the entire military installation. Colonel Hayes, a distinguished officer with 35 years of service, understood immediately that this incident was more than just one instructor losing his temper. The preliminary reports from the 4 colonels who had witnessed the aftermath suggested a pattern of systematic abuse that had been allowed to continue unchecked. This represented a failure of leadership at multiple levels, and Hayes was determined to address every aspect of the problem. The first priority was ensuring the safety and well-being of all recruits who had been under Tank Morrison's supervision. A team of military investigators began interviewing every recruit who had trained under Tank during the previous 6 months. What they discovered was a disturbing pattern of physical and psychological abuse that went far beyond tough military training. Private Maria Santos, a 21-year-old from California, was among the first to be interviewed. She sat across from Major Lisa Chen, a military investigator with extensive experience in handling abuse cases. Santos had been in Tank's training unit 2 months earlier, and her account painted a picture of systematic intimidation and humiliation. "He would make us stand at attention for hours without water breaks," Santos explained, her voice still carrying traces of fear despite Tank's removal. "If anyone moved or complained, he would make them do push-ups until they collapsed. Then he would stand over them and call them weak and worthless. Major Chen took careful notes as Santos continued her testimony. Did Sergeant Major Morrison ever strike you or any other recruits during your training? Santos hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He hit Private Johnson once when Johnson talked back to him. It wasn't as bad as what happened to Private Mitchell, but it was still wrong. We were all too scared to report it because Tank told us that complaining would ruin our military careers. Similar stories emerged from other recruits throughout the day. The investigators documented cases of excessive physical punishment, verbal abuse, sexual harassment, and deliberate humiliation. Tank had created an atmosphere of terror that prevented his victims from seeking help or reporting his crimes. Meanwhile, in the base medical facility, Sarah Mitchell was receiving comprehensive treatment for her injuries. The military doctors who examined her found evidence of significant trauma beyond what was immediately visible. X-rays revealed a cracked rib from her impact with the training mat, and her throat showed signs of severe bruising from the chokehold that had rendered her unconscious. Dr. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician, was appalled by the extent of Sarah's injuries. In her 8 years of treating military personnel, she had never seen assault injuries this severe inflicted by a fellow service member. She carefully documented every injury and prepared a detailed medical report that would be crucial evidence in the upcoming legal proceedings. "How are you feeling, Private Mitchell?" Dr. Walsh asked as she completed her examination. "I know this has been a traumatic experience, but I want you to know that you're safe now and that proper authorities are handling the situation." Sarah winced slightly as she adjusted her position on the examination table. "I'm okay, ma'am. It hurts, but I'll recover. I'm more concerned about what happens next. Will there really be consequences for what Sergeant Major Morrison did?" Dr. Walsh smiled reassuringly. "Based on what I've seen this morning, I can promise you that the command is taking this extremely seriously. Colonel Hayes has ordered a full investigation, and multiple senior officers witnessed the immediate aftermath of the incident. This isn't going to be swept under the rug. While Sarah was receiving medical treatment, the military police were conducting a thorough search of Tank Morrison's quarters and office. What they found provided additional evidence of his misconduct and revealed the extent of his abuse of authority. Hidden in his desk were photographs of recruits in compromising positions, personal files that he had no authorization to possess, and written records of punishments that had never been officially reported. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the lead investigator on the case, was shocked by what they discovered. "I've been investigating military crimes for 12 years, he told his partner, and I've rarely seen such a clear case of systematic abuse. Morrison didn't just lose his temper. The search also revealed Tank's personal journal, where he had written detailed accounts of his interactions with recruits. The entry showed a disturbing pattern of thoughts that revealed his enjoyment of causing fear and pain. So, one entry, written just days before the incident with Sarah, read, 'These new recruits think they're entitled to respect. They need to learn that respect is earned through suffering and submission.' As news of the investigation spread throughout Fort Bradley, other victims began coming forward voluntarily. Former recruits who had completed their training under Tank months or even years earlier contacted the base to report their own experiences of abuse. The scope of the investigation expanded rapidly as investigators realized they were dealing with a pattern of criminal behavior that had continued for years. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Williams, in her role as Inspector General, coordinated the expanding investigation. Her office became the central hub for collecting testimonies, evidence, and witness statements. The sheer volume of complaints that emerged painted a picture of institutional failure that went beyond one rogue instructor. "We're looking at systemic problems," Williams explained to Colonel Hayes during a briefing. Morrison's behavior was enabled by a culture that prioritized results over methods. Multiple people in the chain of command either knew about his methods or should have known. We need to examine how this was allowed to continue for so long. The investigation revealed that several junior instructors had reported concerns about Tank's methods to their immediate supervisors over the years. However, these reports had been dismissed or ignored because Tank's units consistently produced soldiers who performed well in combat situations. The military's focus on results had overshadowed concerns about how those results were achieved. Master Sergeant Lisa Chen, who had been the first to intervene during the incident with Sarah, was interviewed extensively about her observations of Tank's behavior. "I'd heard rumors about his methods," she admitted to investigators. But I never witnessed anything directly until that morning. The military culture made it difficult to challenge someone of his rank and reputation without solid proof. The investigation also examined the role of the base's medical staff in failing to identify patterns of abuse. Emergency room records showed multiple visits by Tank's recruits for injuries that should have raised red flags. However, the injuries had been attributed to training accidents rather than deliberate assault, and no comprehensive analysis had been conducted to identify patterns. Captain Walsh found herself reviewing months of medical records as part of the investigation. Looking back, she told investigators, there were definitely warning signs that we should have caught. But the recruits rarely complained about their injuries, and we assumed they were just the normal result of intense training. As the investigation progressed, Tank Morrison sat in a holding cell awaiting formal charges. His 20-year career was effectively over, but the legal process was just beginning. Military prosecutors were building a case that could result in decades of imprisonment and the loss of all military benefits and honors. Colonel David Park, the base's staff judge advocate, was overseeing the legal aspects of the case. The evidence against Tank was overwhelming, but Park wanted to ensure that the prosecution was handled properly to prevent any possibility of the case being dismissed on technicalities. We're dealing with multiple counts of assault, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Park explained to his legal team. The evidence is strong, but we need to be thorough in our preparation to ensure that justice is served. The charges against Tank continued to multiply as more victims came forward. What had started as a single incident of assault had evolved into a comprehensive indictment of years of criminal behavior. Each new testimony added to the weight of evidence that would eventually destroy Tank's defense. Meanwhile, the recruits who had witnessed the original incident were receiving counseling and support to help them process their traumatic experience. Military psychologists worked with each of them individually to address the psychological impact of seeing their fellow soldier assaulted by their instructor. Private Rodriguez, who had attempted to intervene during the attack on Sarah, struggled with guilt about not doing more to protect her. "I keep thinking I should have stopped him," he told the counselor. "Maybe if I had acted sooner, Sarah wouldn't have been hurt so badly." The counselor, Captain Robert Martinez, helped Rodriguez understand that his intervention had actually been crucial in preventing even worse abuse. "Your willingness to speak up, despite the risk to yourself, showed tremendous courage. You helped create the situation that led to Sergeant Major Morrison being stopped." As the days passed, the full scope of Tank's crimes became clear. Investigators had identified more than 30 victims over a 5-year period, including cases of sexual harassment, assault, and psychological abuse. The pattern of behavior suggested someone who had systematically used his position of authority to harm the very people he was supposed to train and protect. The investigation also revealed that Tank's abusive behavior had extended beyond recruit training. Female officers and non-commissioned officers reported incidents of sexual harassment and intimidation that had created a hostile work environment throughout the training command. Tank's influence had poisoned the culture of an entire military installation. Colonel Hayes found himself facing difficult questions about how such widespread abuse had been allowed to continue. The investigation was revealing systemic failures in oversight, reporting procedures, and accountability mechanisms. Changes would need to be made to prevent similar incidents in the future. The media attention surrounding the case began to grow as word of the investigation leaked to local newspapers. Stories about military abuse always attracted public interest, and the Fort Bradley incident was particularly shocking because of the severity of the assault and the number of victims involved. Sarah Mitchell found herself at the center of a media storm she never wanted. Reporters sought interviews about her experience, and her face became associated with efforts to reform military training. Despite the attention, Sarah remained focused on her recovery and her determination to continue serving her country. "I didn't join the military to become famous," she told the base public affairs officer. "I joined to serve my country with honor. I hope that what happened to me will prevent other soldiers from experiencing the same abuse. But I want to be remembered as a soldier, not just as a victim." The investigation that began with 4 colonels arriving unexpectedly at a training ground had evolved into a comprehensive examination of military culture and accountability. Tank Morrison's assault of Sarah Mitchell had exposed problems that went far beyond one instructor's criminal behavior. and the solutions would require fundamental changes in how the military trained and protected its people. As the legal proceedings against Tank moved forward, the military justice system prepared to send a clear message that abuse of authority would not be tolerated regardless of rank, experience, or past service record. The young woman from Ohio, who had refused to quit despite being choked unconscious, had sparked a transformation that would protect countless future soldiers from similar abuse. 6 months later, the courtroom at Fort Bradley was packed with spectators as the court-martial of former Sergeant Major Robert Morrison reached its conclusion. The military justice system had worked methodically through the mountain of evidence collected during the investigation, and the prosecution had built an overwhelming case against the man who had terrorized recruits for years. Tank Morrison sat at the defendant's table, a shadow of his former intimidating self. The powerful figure who had once struck fear into the hearts of young soldiers now appeared small and defeated. His military decorations had been stripped away, his uniform replaced with civilian clothes, and his future reduced to the possibility of decades in military prison. Colonel Janet Patterson, the military judge presiding over the court-martial, had listened to weeks of testimony from victims, witnesses, and character witnesses. The evidence presented painted a picture of systematic abuse that shocked even experienced military legal professionals. Tank had been found guilty on 17 separate charges, including assault, battery, sexual harassment, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery, her presence serving as a powerful reminder of the courage that had brought Tank's crimes to light. She had testified earlier in the proceedings, describing in detail the assault that had ended Tank's career and sparked the investigation. Her clear, unwavering testimony had been one of the most compelling pieces of evidence presented by the prosecution. Private Rodriguez sat next to Sarah, along with several other recruits who had found the courage to testify against their former instructor. The young man from Texas had overcome his initial fear and become one of the strongest witnesses against Tank. His testimony about attempting to intervene during the assault had demonstrated the moral courage that the military sought to instill in its soldiers. Colonel Park, who had prosecuted the case, stood to address the court during the sentencing phase. Your Honor, the defendant's crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in him by the United States military and by the young soldiers he was supposed to train and protect. For 5 years, he used his position of authority to inflict physical and psychological harm on dozens of victims. Park continued, the evidence shows that the defendant's actions were not isolated incidents of poor judgment, but rather part of a calculated pattern of abuse designed to satisfy his own twisted need for power and control. His victims were young people who had volunteered to serve their country, and they deserved protection and professional training, not assault and humiliation. Tank's defense attorney, Major Robert Kim, made one final attempt to mitigate his client's sentence. Your Honor, my client served his country for 20 years and received numerous commendations for his service. While his actions were inexcusable, we ask the court to consider his previous record of service and the possibility of rehabilitation. Colonel Patterson listened to both sides before announcing her decision. The courtroom fell silent as she began to speak. The defendant's previous service record, while noteworthy, cannot excuse or diminish the severity of his crimes. His rank and experience made his conduct more reprehensible, not less, because he knew better and chose to abuse his authority anyway, she continued. The evidence presented in this case demonstrates a pattern of criminal behavior that spans multiple years and affected dozens of victims. The defendant used his position of trust to inflict harm on the very people he was sworn to protect and train. This represents not just a crime against individual victims, but an assault on the values and integrity of the United States military. Tank Morrison was sentenced to 25 years in military prison, reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a dishonorable discharge from the United States Army. The sentence sent a clear message throughout the military that abuse of authority would be met with the full force of military justice. As Tank was led away in handcuffs, Sarah Mitchell felt a sense of closure that had been months in the making. The young woman who had refused to quit despite being choked unconscious and struck in the face had seen justice served. Her courage had not only protected herself, but had resulted in accountability for years of abuse that had harmed countless other soldiers. The transformation at Fort Bradley extended far beyond Tank Morrison's punishment. Colonel Hayes had implemented sweeping reforms designed to prevent similar abuse from occurring in the future. New oversight procedures required multiple instructors to be present during all training exercises, and anonymous reporting systems were established to encourage victims to come forward without fear of retaliation. Master Sergeant Lisa Chen had been promoted to Training Command Sergeant Major, making her responsible for overseeing all recruit training at the base. Her intervention during the incident with Sarah had demonstrated the kind of leadership and moral courage that the military needed in its training programs. "We've learned that tough training and abusive training are not the same thing," Chen explained during a briefing to new instructors. "Our job is to prepare soldiers for the challenges they will face in their military careers, but we must do so with respect for their dignity and their rights as human beings." The new training protocols emphasized psychological safety alongside physical preparation. Recruits were educated about their rights and responsibilities, and clear channels were established for reporting inappropriate conduct by instructors. Regular psychological evaluations were implemented for all training personnel to identify potential problems before they could escalate. Dr. Captain Walsh, who had treated Sarah's injuries, was appointed to head a new medical oversight program designed to identify patterns of training-related injuries that might indicate abuse. "We're taking a proactive approach now," she explained. "Instead of just treating injuries, we're analyzing them to identify potential problems in training programs." Sarah Mitchell had recovered fully from her physical injuries, but the psychological impact of her experience had taken longer to heal. She worked with military counselors to process the trauma while continuing her training under new, professional instructors who exemplified the best of military leadership. "I'm grateful that my experience led to positive changes," Sarah said during an interview with the base newspaper. "But I also want other soldiers to know that they don't have to suffer in silence. There are people who will listen and who will take action when someone abuses their authority." Sarah's courage had inspired other victims throughout the military to come forward with their own stories of abuse. The Fort Bradley incident had become a catalyst for examining training practices throughout the entire military system. Congressional committees launched investigations into military training standards, and new policies were implemented to protect service members from abuse. Private Rodriguez had also thrived under the new training environment. His courage in standing up to Tank Morrison had earned him recognition from senior leaders, and he was selected for advanced leadership training. "I learned that real courage isn't about being fearless," he said. "It's about doing the right thing even when you're afraid of the consequences." The other recruits who had witnessed Tank's abuse found healing through their participation in the investigation and trial. Many of them had struggled with guilt and trauma, but counseling and support from their peers helped them process their experiences and continue their military careers. The systemic changes at Fort Bradley extended beyond training procedures to include cultural transformation. Regular climate surveys were conducted to assess the health of the command environment, and senior leaders were held accountable for creating positive conditions for their subordinates. Colonel Williams, who had played a crucial role in the investigation, was promoted to brigadier general and assigned to develop military-wide policies for preventing abuse in training environments. Her experience with the Fort Bradley case had convinced military leaders that comprehensive reform was necessary. The Morrison case taught us that we can't rely on the assumption that good people will always do the right thing, Williams explained. "We need systems and procedures that make it easy to report problems and impossible to ignore them when they occur." The media coverage of Tank's trial and sentencing had focused national attention on military training practices. While some coverage was critical of the military's handling of the situation, most commentators praised the swift and decisive action taken once the abuse was discovered. The case became an example of accountability and reform within the military justice system. Tank Morrison's victims found various ways to heal and move forward with their lives. Some continued their military careers, determined to prove that they were stronger than the abuse they had suffered. Others chose to leave the military but remained advocates for reform and protection of service members' rights. The Fort Bradley Training Center was renamed the Sarah Mitchell Center for Excellence in Military Training, honoring the young woman whose courage had sparked transformation throughout the military. The naming ceremony attracted senior military leaders from throughout the country, who spoke about the importance of moral courage and accountability. Sarah, now promoted to corporal, spoke at the dedication ceremony. I hope that this center will serve as a reminder that every soldier, regardless of rank or experience, has the right to be treated with dignity and respect. We must never forget that the strength of our military comes from the character of the people who serve, not from the fear they might feel. The lessons learned from Tank Morrison's crimes extended far beyond Fort Bradley. Military installations throughout the country implemented similar reforms, and training programs were redesigned to emphasize respect for human dignity alongside military effectiveness. The case became a turning point in military culture that protected countless future service members. Years later, as Sarah Mitchell continued to serve her country with distinction, she reflected on the morning that had changed everything. The young woman from Ohio who had joined the military to escape poverty and serve her country had achieved far more than she had ever imagined. Her refusal to submit to Tank Morrison's intimidation had not only saved her own dignity but had protected countless other soldiers from similar abuse. The transformation that began with 4 colonels arriving unexpectedly at a training ground had reshaped military culture throughout the entire system. Tank Morrison's assault of Sarah Mitchell had exposed the difference between legitimate military training and abuse of power, and the military's response had demonstrated its commitment to protecting the people who volunteered to serve their country. Justice had been served, but more importantly, positive change had been achieved that would protect future generations of soldiers. The courage of one young recruit had sparked a transformation that would strengthen the military for years to come, proving that even in the most hierarchical organization, individual moral courage could create lasting change. The story of Tank Morrison's downfall served as a powerful reminder that accountability applies to everyone, regardless of rank or reputation. Sarah Mitchell's courage had shown that justice was possible, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against those who dared to speak truth to power. Her legacy would live on in the improved training programs and cultural changes that protected the rights and dignity of all service members.